So we can start with this slide then, the changing wildfires in Europe, and we'll take the next slide, please. So this has been a topic increasing on the agenda, as you are well aware of, and the latest IPCC report predicts a very dramatic increase in extreme wildfires on a global scale, up by 30% until 2050. And one important issue as well is that we are starting to see wildfires in areas where they have not normally occurred, which is very concerning. And in Europe, we all have experienced that fire events escalated way beyond their normal size and intensity. So next slide, please. And we are calling this changing wildfires because it's changing in many ways. And one is that we are experiencing wildfires much earlier in the season, while fires usually start to occur in July and have a peak in August. Recently, like for example 2022, we started to see large areas and large wildfires starting already in spring, March, April, which is unusual and concerning because we don't have any detailed understanding of what effects this would have on biodiversity in the areas affected. Next slide, please. And areas that are affected by wildfire are increasing, and particularly in Southern Europe. And this summer, Greece was severely hit by nearly 4 times the average area burned. But we also had very severe fires in Italy, for example. Next slide. And in Canada this year, there were very large-scale fires. And one concerning aspect of those very large-scale fires was the emission of carbon, which was still measurements are going on. But so far, it seems like 2023, the emission of carbon as a result of these large-scale fires is 6 times more than the long-term average over the same period. And this is, of course, very of great concern. And forest scientists in Canada started to analyze what could be done in the future to actually address this. And next slide, please. Because fires are not only resulting in carbon emissions to the burning, but also affecting the carbon storage capacity through the change in biomass. And here's an example of management starting to be introduced in Canada to address this. So to the right, you see a case with no grazing and where you have a forest that is quite dense and with heavy brush and with great likelihood that you will have fire burns into the canopy and very large scale and hot fires with large scale damage and an effect on the carbon storage. To the left, you see what could be done with different types of management, for example, introducing more grazing, which will thin the forest and reduce the amount of shrubs and brush, and you would have a less likelihood of fires affecting the canopy, and your carbon storage have a higher likelihood of recovering over time. So next slide, please. So that was an example of intervention to reduce the risks, and the conclusion we made in the SAPEA report was that and this was based on a study from UNEP, that in general, direct emergency responses receive the bulk of available funding, while planning and prevention typically get less than 1%. And our conclusion was that we think that EU states should do substantial reallocations of public spending on wildfires with much more on proactive measures preventing wildfires and reducing risks compared to what is happening today. So next slide, please. And as a result of that, ISAC, which I'm also working with, and I'm actually the project director of a new project, Changing Wildfires in Europe, where we will attempt to make a critical analysis of the evidence base for a range of proactive actions, which include landscape management, grazing, prescribed burning, and fire regime management. We will also explore design principles to guide the massive EU tree planting program as part of the EU biodiversity strategy to avoid adding substantial flammable fuel in many vulnerable landscapes across Europe. And this report, which will be ongoing in 2024, will link to a number of EU policy areas: the climate strategy, biodiversity strategy, farm to fork strategy, EU forest strategy, and of course also the new nature restoration law. Next slide, please. So these fires are happening to a background of more and more extreme droughts, but we are not only experiencing more extreme droughts, also we are experiencing more and more wet extremes, as you could see from this compilation. And next slide, please. And we had tragic pictures coming and reports from the city of Derna in Libya just a few weeks ago with a massive flooding, destroying large parts of the city and causing huge casualties. And next slide, please. And also in Europe, a picture from Sicily where drought and fires caused a lot of damage also in built-up areas and with very large consequences. Next slide, please. So this increase in wet and dry extremes are also happening against the background of much slower processes happening as an effect of globalization. So first of all, I want to point out that we have been seeing a shifting diversity. So historically, if we look back, we can measure diversity, for example, of food or sources of information, and you would find that in each local area, that diversity would be relatively low, but you had a relatively high diversity when you compared locations across different parts of the world. This contrasts to what we are increasingly seeing today, where locally, when it comes to, for example, food and sources of information, we have an increased diversity on the local scale. On the other hand, we have simultaneously a global simplification. So local diversity is increasing, but we have an increase in global simplification. Next slide, please. And we also have a shifting modularity and connectivity as a result of globalization. So previously, we had a situation with high modularity and low connectivity. So we had local settlements that internally might have had high connectivity, but connectivity across larger distances were relatively low. And if you go to the right of the picture, we have now the opposite with very, very high connectivity and relatively low modularity. And this combination of global simplification, understanding crisis and crisis management. The next slide, please. because this has resulted in deeper studies on the concept of polycrisis, where you have a cascade of crises colliding. A polycrisis would be something that is made up of several crises, distinct but entangled, causing damage much greater than the sum of their individual harms. Next slide, please. So what could we do in a world where there is an increased probability of polycrisis occurring? One concept we explored in the SAPIA report, and which has been explored in academic literature, is the concept of response diversity, which actually means that there is necessary to have diverse ways among species, actors, infrastructures, which perform functions, but different and diverse ways which they respond to shocks, and avoiding that all of these players respond in the same way. And as a result, the system as a whole would continue functioning in much the same way over a range of different shocks. Next slide, please. So a very simple way of explaining response diversity could be a case where we, for example, have 7 different players or entities in the system. Levels of response diversity, one with 7 different responses and the other with 2 different responses. When there is a shock affecting one of these, on the right side, the resulting effect is very, very different depending on the level of response diversity. And this figure could represent many, many different types of systems, ecosystems, banks, financial systems, for example. Next slide, please. And in general, we can say that there tend to be a trade-off between efficiency and response diversity. So to the left, you will have a self-organized network with lots of connections. We might, in the name of making a system more sustainable and more efficient, design the system in specific ways, reducing redundancy and reducing the number of connections among players and actors. And by doing that, we are often high risk of losing response diversity. So efficiency is a concept we really need to understand much more deeply, and what the consequences are, because it's not only a way of meeting sustainability targets. Next slide, please. And this is another way of illustrating this, that if we view sustainability as very much a normative concept where efficiency is the important variable, we might end up in situations where we are losing response diversity if we invest in very high efficiency systems and optimization processes. While on the other hand, to have more response diversity in that development, we should think of designing diversity, redundancy, and connectivity into the system, and much more emphasize cross-scale systems perspective. And when it comes to governance, polycentric and collaborative governance. Next slide, please. So looking at in this perspective of cascading crisis and polycrisis, we say that along a trajectory where we moving from a situation where we have crisis with low severity, and we often apply a coping capacity, which you could say is if you are hit by a flooding or a fire, you use your savings in the bank account. And if and that could be enough if that the event is not too intense and not occurring too frequently. If it does, if it's very intense and occur very frequently, coping capacity is no longer sufficient. You have to adapt to the new situation and making several adjustments. In case there is an increase in intensity and frequency even further, even adaptive capacity might be exhausted, and you have to think of transforming into something completely different. And then you could take the next. And so the need for response diversity in policy and management will increase along this trajectory, moving from these coping adaptive to transformative capacity. Next slide, please. So in summary, the take-home message around response diversity is quite complex. But one thing I want to point out is scale is very important, that local diversification may occur at the expense of global simplification, which may have multiple consequences. We have to also be aware of the serious trade-offs that what we are doing in our daily life of trying to increase efficiency and often to meet targets of sustainability often reduce options for response diversity. And maintaining response diversity entails social and financial costs. So we need to have that as part of our social discourse around how we're going to deal with polycrisis in the future.